Protectionism is naturally a follow-up to the free trade presentation. Protectionism is any government restriction on free trade that intends to promote domestic industries over foreign industries. And those who argue in favor of protectionism see that there are problems with free trade. Probably the argument of protectionism that is going to gain the most support, although this argument may even be flawed, we'll talk about that later, is the loss of domestic jobs. The idea that foreign competitiveness can cause a loss of jobs at home, especially in developed countries where wages are higher. Overdependence on foreign producers, the idea that countries that trade might become too dependent on other countries to survive. That's a concern. Infant industries, new industries competing against foreign competition. How will you ever successfully have infant industries if there's always the threat of foreign competition? Dumping, you should know the definition, is the idea of if a country overproduces a product, they don't want to sell it within their own market because it would drop the price too low. So maybe they will export it to another country and sell it at a very low price, lower than they would consider selling at home, perhaps even slightly lower than the cost of production, just to make up for some of the losses. The problem with dumping is that it disrupts whatever economy or whatever market the dumping is occurring in, so you want to protect yourself from that. Concerns about quality, maybe an argument about protectionism is if we allow foreign goods in, those foreign goods are inferior and put our citizens in harm's way. And then one last argument is that tariffs are also a source of government revenue that can be used to help citizens at home. Again, all of these problems we'll address later because for each one of these arguments for protectionism, there is an effective counter-argument. So the first of the three major types of protectionism is a tariff. Tariff is a duty or a tax on imports to increase the price of foreign goods and services, making these foreign goods and services less appealing. And it's easily explained through a diagram. Some of these diagrams are a little intimidating, but if you understand them, then you will thoroughly understand the actual concept as well. So here is our free trade diagram. You would start with this, of course, and then you would add the tariff line. And so the tariff line is a shift upwards from the S-world line. I call it S-world plus tariff. You could label it slightly differently if you'd like. Just make sure when you explain it, you refer to it the correct way. And on the y-axis, I labeled PW plus tariff, so the world price with the tariff in effect. And very important is that you're able to explain the Q's below, the quantities that occur. So before the tariff, let me go back here for a moment, domestic consumers were purchasing from the domestic supply from 0 to Q1, and then they purchased from the world supply from Q1 to Q2. Now with the tariff, the domestic consumers are going to ignore that blue line. Once the shift occurs, the blue line is old news. Now the domestic consumers, our consumers, are going to buy longer from S domestic from 0 to Q3, which is an improvement over 0 to Q1. Now 0 to Q3 is consumed from the domestic supply, and then only Q3 to Q4 comes from the world supply, the new S world plus tariff. And then at Q4, you'll notice that the demand is satisfied, and so if we look down here, it goes 0 to Q3 from domestic, Q3 to Q4. That demand is satisfied through imports. And then there used to be consumption all the way up to Q2. That no longer happens because now there are not as many goods available at a low price. So the demand goes away sooner because the goods are no longer offered at such a low price. What are the problems with the tariff? The concerns are the higher consumer prices and less total consumption, which leads to less variety. I can pop back to the diagram one more time, and you can see the higher prices along the y-axis. And you can see that the total quantity in the market, it was Q2. People were buying Q2 of the product. Now they're only going to be buying up to Q4. So if there's less total product in the market, now there's less variety. And also, the other benefits of free trade that we discussed in the free trade presentation are all going to be gone, such as the benefits of efficiency and the competition and the strong political relationships. Subsidy is when a government makes a payment to domestic producers based on the amount of product produced to make those domestic producers more competitive against foreign producers. So it's just government money to domestic producers to make them more competitive. To diagram this, I once again start with a free trade diagram. And then I'm going to shift S domestic to the right to S domestic plus subsidy. And this means that the domestic firms can now produce at a cheaper, they can produce more because of that government subsidy. So it's easier for domestic firms to produce. That's why I shift the S curve, the supply curve, to the right. And so now, instead of, because the firms can produce more, they can also offer it at a cheaper price, and that's reflected after the rightward shift from 0 all the way to Q3, because now the firms are producing more of the product. And so that low price S world only comes into play here at Q3, because now, again, domestic consumers are buying domestic supply instead of 0 to Q1. Now they're buying it from 0 to Q3. But then at Q3, the S world kicks in again, and the domestic consumers will purchase from S world from Q3 to Q2. So notice that the total consumption does not go down. There's still Q2 amount of whatever the product is being consumed in this market. But consumers are going to buy from the domestic producers for a longer period. More of the product is coming from domestic producers because they're now able to more easily produce the product thanks to the government subsidy. The problem with the subsidy is the cost to the government and in turn society. When the government bears a cost, it comes from taxpayer dollars. It also means the government cannot provide some service to its citizens, so society is being hurt there. Also, again, the other benefits of free trade, such as I just said before, competition, international relationships, those go away. Subsidy is interesting in that you'll notice that at the end of the day, for consumers, prices are still lower, and the total consumption, therefore the total variety, is still the same as it was before the subsidy, but it's because the government is paying the cost as opposed to the consumer paying the cost, like with the tariff. Finally, the third major type of protectionism is a quota. A quota is a government limit on imports to promote consumption of domestically produced goods and services. It's, in a way, the most severe of the three protectionism types because it's blatant. It's not as subtle as a tariff or a subsidy. It's just a straight up quantitative limit on how much of a product is allowed into the country. So to draw it again, here is our free trade diagram. We always start with this because we want to show what the market looks like before the protectionism. And then we draw the S domestic after quota line once coming from someplace off of S world. And you can really draw it in almost any arbitrary place between Q1 and Q2. Let's explain why. So first, the domestic consumers are going to buy from the domestic suppliers up to when they have P world and S world really available to them. And so from Q1 to Q3, the domestic consumers will consume the world supply because it's offered at a lower price than the domestic supply. But then, all of a sudden, the government steps in and says, well, there's a quota. There's a limit on how much of the product is allowed into the country. And so we draw a Q3 line there. Q1 to Q3, that is a quota. That's a quantifiable limit right there. And then the consumers are looking for more of the product still. If it wasn't for the quota, they would have kept consuming from S world, but because of the quota, S world is no longer available. So they go back to the domestic supply. So we have to shift domestic supply over to the right to resume wherever that quota pretty much cut off S world. So we shift that curve over, and now the domestic consumers are going to consume this bit of domestic supply once again. And at the end of the day, some of them are going to have to pay a higher price than P world and consumption will stop at Q4 because once we get to this intersection, the demand is satisfied. So if you follow my cursor here, first the domestic consumers buy from the domestic supply, then they buy from the world supply until the quota kicks in, and then they go back to the domestic supply until the rest of the demand is fulfilled. The problem with the quota is, again, high consumer prices. People have to now not enjoy P world from here to here, but they have to, at the end, some people are paying a little higher price because they have no choice. They have to buy from the domestic producers that produce at a higher price. Also, there's less total consumption. Just like with the tariff, we initially saw consumption from 0 to Q2 of the product in the market when it was just free trade. Now it's only 0 to Q4, so if there's less total product, there's also less variety in the market. And the other benefits of free trade, just like tariff and subsidy, are all missing because free trade is being limited. So let's talk about why the protectionist argument has some flaws. The first, loss of domestic jobs. It is true that free trade can lead to a loss of some jobs. It is, for example, why the United States and some U.S. politicians have found success in rallying against, say, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, because some goods can be produced in Mexico where the cost of labor is cheaper, and that's going to negatively impact American jobs. But in the long term, in a world that is becoming ever more international, it might be impossible to keep some of these jobs when there's so many options for these manufactured products to be produced by low-cost labor. So the argument against loss of domestic jobs is those countries should support new industries where their workforce is most competitive. So using America as an example, America needs to invest more in, say, the STEM educational field, science, technology, engineering, and math, because those are areas where America's workforce might be able to outcompete against the international workforce. And so that there needs to be an adjustment. Harsh argument if you're one of those people who lose their jobs in the process. Overdependence on foreign producers. It's hard to imagine a world really where, say, China and the United States would go to war because they are so interdependent that to go to war against each other would hurt themselves so much economically. Not to mention, even if you were to go to war with a country, free trade gives you many other supply options. So this argument is kind of hyped up and overstated. It's really not such a big threat in most cases. Infant industries really need protection from foreign competitors because they're offered a lot of support at home. And using America again as an example, America offers a lot of business loans to startups that can help them compete. And so infant industries, especially in developed countries, aren't always at a disadvantage to foreign competitors. Dumping is a legitimate problem, but you have organizations like the World Trade Organization that do their best to limit dumping. Concerns about quality, also legitimate, but you can monitor things like quality and dumping without completely blocking free trade. And finally, saying that tariffs are a source of government revenue, while that's true, that really is separate from any argument in favor of protectionism, meaning you can't justify losing the benefits of free trade because the tariffs are a source of government revenue. There are many different sources of government revenue, and while small tariffs might be justifiable, they really aren't as a valid source of government revenue because of all the negatives that can come from that type of protectionism. So before we wrap up our protectionism presentation, I just want to remind you that you also have sanctions and embargoes, other types of limitations on free trade that are not quite protectionism. Those are done for political reasons. They're not done to support domestic industries. So don't use those when you're talking about protectionism. Focus on tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. And remember that sometimes, even though free trade can hurt in the short term, in the long term, it seems that the world is becoming ever more integrated, and free trade is something that many countries will have to adjust to.